Good evening, everybody, and welcome to St James's Church, Piccadilly. This is the latest in our collaboration with JustShare, with whom we host debates on a wide range of social issues. Tonight we are debating the housing shortage and asking what should we be campaigning for. We will be tweeting throughout this debate. For those of you who know about such things, it's hashtag SJP Housing. And we're really delighted that one of our speakers is Amanda Walters from West London Citizens. There is a group from Citizens UK who'll be here tonight, and at the refreshments afterwards, if you want to tell them any particular stories that you have of housing difficulties in London or positive stories about housing, they're collecting stories which is part of the Citizens campaign leading up to the London mayoral elections in the spring of next year. So if you would like to talk to them, they'll make themselves known at the end, and do please give them your experience, as we said, positive or negative, about housing in London. So the format for the evening is that in a few moments I will ask each speaker to come in turn and give their opening presentations. They have about 10 minutes each for that, and we will really try to keep to time, so good luck speakers with speaking for just 10 minutes. That would be very helpful, thank you. And then after that we'll have about half an hour for discussion and for Q&A. The acoustics in this beautiful Christopher Wren church are challenging, so even if you think you've got a really loud voice, please use the microphone, because then others will be able to hear you. We've got a roving mic that will go around the audience towards the end. So as the speakers are speaking, do please be thinking of comments that you'd like to make or questions that you would like to ask. And then at about 7:45, we'll ask each of the speakers to just give us a closing remark, and perhaps I could give them warning of what it is I'm going to ask them. I'm going to ask each of you, what one thing can we do as the audience from this evening? So we'll be asking you for a practical suggestion right at the end, and then we'll finish before 8 o'clock. And there are some refreshments over here. There's wine of both colours, and there's fresh orange juice as well. So we do hope that you can stay for a little bit afterwards. So, welcome to our housing debate. The housing shortage, what should we be campaigning for? Our first speaker tonight is John Bibby, who is the policy officer at Shelter. John works in the policy team at Shelter, where he works on a range of areas. His recent work has included analysing proposals for reforming rent regulation in the private rented sector, and assessing the likely impact of the government's proposals to force councils to sell council homes. Before joining Shelter, John spent 5 years working in London local government. Would you please welcome John Bibby?
Okay, hello. 10 minutes is a very short period of time, so I'm sorry if I rattle or race, and do tell me to slow down if I'm going too quickly, but I'm sure I'll get told off, so please don't. That's not a genuine plea. So I'm going to try very quickly to say what the effects of the problem of London's housing shortage are, what the cause, why the problem is occurring, what the causes of it are, and third, what we can do about it. So here we go. In terms of the problems, the effects of this problem, I think it roughly falls into 3 different areas. The first is an increasing prevalence of homelessness of all kinds. The second is an increase in housing need of other sorts, which are not homelessness, so housing need short of homelessness. And the third is a kind of rather toe-curling, if you like, but a very serious problem about curbs on aspiration and people's aspiration to own a home. So, to begin with homelessness, when most people think about homelessness initially, then they have a vision of a rough sleeper. So I think it's worthwhile starting with rough sleeping. And the number of people who are rough sleeping in London every year is increasing at the moment. Both City Hall and the government agree that that's the case. They just disagree about how much it's increasing by. the government thinking that roughly approaching 40% increase year on year, and City Hall thinking it's around sort of 15-16%. City Hall think around 7,500 people slept for one night on the streets last year, or at least one night on the streets last year. Shelter doesn't typically Shelter doesn't typically work with rough sleepers that much, because there are many other housing charities that work with rough sleepers, like Crisis, St Mungo's Broadway. So we typically work with homeless households who have a bed to sleep in at night, but they don't have a home to go to. And they are, the largest group of these are those who are living in temporary accommodation. So people who've gone to their council and said that they believe they're homeless, and they then spend time in temporary accommodation, which is something like a bed and breakfast or a hostel, which is often not very nice accommodation. It's typically one room, it can be shared bathroom facilities, shared kitchen, cooking facilities, shared bathing facilities. Often you can get whole families having to share a single bed, for example. And that is a much larger problem than just the problem of those individuals who are spending the night on the street, because most people have a way to avoid spending the night on the street. So in terms of those individuals who are in temporary accommodation, across London at the moment there are around 50,000 households, and most of those are families who are in temporary accommodation, which includes 80,000 children who are homeless and in temporary accommodation, living in that sort of accommodation. So we have those who are on the streets, those who have a bed but don't have a home to go to, and then there's also an increase in the number of types of homelessness which are sort of squeezing out the edges, which are not slipping through the net that is there, and not necessarily being picked up by any particular part of the system. And there are sort of indicators that you can point to which demonstrate that this is happening, which are things like an increase in councils, intentionally or unintentionally, trying to put people off from coming to them to claim that they're homeless, which gets called gatekeeping. So it's an example of, you don't make the information about how you can apply to be homeless very obvious, and you make it very difficult for people to apply. So we have this, the reason that's occurring obviously is there's an increase in the need and the demand for homelessness services, whilst at the same time councils don't have the resources to direct towards them. So you've got an increase in need combined with fewer resources to actually be able to address the problem. So that's the increase in homelessness, and that is an increase in all forms of homelessness across London. But there is an awful lot of housing need which doesn't actually ever sort of get to the situation of homelessness, which is nevertheless incredibly serious. And I think the one biggest problem that we have with this at the moment are the number of people who are living in the private rented sector and facing unaffordable rents, poor conditions, and also have very poor security of tenure. So if we take those things in turn very quickly, when it comes to the affordability of renting in London, the average amount of household income that renting families in London spend on their rent is 60% after they get their benefits, but before they're taxed on their income. So if you can imagine, that's a very high bar to say that they're paying 60% of their income on their rent. And that, of course, means that they have very little money left over to spend on everything else, like food, clothing, leisure activities, and all the rest of it. And it means that London renters are being faced with very difficult, impossible choices about what do you cut back on. How do you change your living circumstances to try to get around the high level of rent? And really, there aren't that many options. Shelter hears from people every day who are doing things like cutting back on the amount of money that they're spending on food, and that includes skipping meals. But the other options, why don't you move to a cheaper part of town, really aren't there for them, because affordability is a problem across London, and if you move to another part of town, say you've got a job near where you currently work, then that can increase other costs. So London renters are being faced by impossible choices because of the cost of renting. Very quickly, conditions is a problem across the private rented sector. Around a third of all private rented homes would fail the government decent home standard. And in 1 in 5 private rented sector properties, there is a hazard which poses a threat to the renter's life. So that's things like exposed wires or, gaps in the floor that you might fall down break your neck or whatever. And then finally, also poor security, which is just because we have a private rented sector which is set up where the rules of the game, the regulation, is set up for a previous age where the private rented sector used to just be the preserve of students and young people and something that they would do as a stopgap where they didn't spend particularly long. That's now changed. 30% of all families in London, so everybody who's a household with a child in London lives in the private rented sector, and a large number of private renters are unlikely to ever find another tenure to live in. And then finally, aspiration, obviously, it's worth acknowledging that the overwhelming majority of Londoners do want to own their own home. And whilst we might not, whilst you might think that that's a sort of luxury, that is just the sort of the facts of life. And London's housing shortage has pushed that aspiration further out of reach to the extent that actually there are a large number of people now who believe that they should be able to buy a home who will never be able to buy a home in London. So very quickly, why is it happening? Well, it sort of takes two things. It takes two to tango. It takes two things to create a housing shortage. And the first part of that is socioeconomic trends, and the second part is an under-responsive of housing supply to those socioeconomic trends. So when I say socioeconomic trends, I mean things like fewer households leaving London, going to other parts of the country, ageing under-occupiers, so people living longer and staying in the home that they've lived in for a very long time, but they're not using up all the space, a growing population, and family breakdown and things like that, so people needing to move out. And then the under-responsiveness of London's housing supply is just a question of numbers. That socio-economic trend means that we need roughly 60,000 homes in London a year if we're going to keep up with it, but we're only building about 24,000 homes. So what can we do about it? Well, socio-economic trends are very difficult to do something about. It's really the thing that's driving the need for homes. If people stop being born, or if people stop breaking up, or if people stop moving to London, or if people stop living in homes that are bigger than their needs, or owning second homes, then there wouldn't really be a problem. But the problem is that those things are incredibly difficult to do something about unless you're going to act in an incredibly authoritarian way, and they're even more difficult to undo. It's very difficult to undo a birth after it's occurred. Policy, therefore, has a sort of small and very speculative influence over socioeconomic trends, and they can be very deeply unpopular to engage. So the bedroom tax is a perfect example of this. You know, we have a stock of social rented homes. The government thought, well, we should be using this more efficiently. There are plenty of older people who are over-occupying those homes. Therefore, all we really need to do is get them to move out into smaller homes. But the only way you're able to do that is make it so that it is financially impossible for them to remain in that home. You have to force them out of that home. And that has an awful lot of unpopular effects. I mean, because it's quite a brutal thing to do. And in any case, that is only one part of the housing market that the state has control over. If you can imagine what you would have to do to force people out of living in large market homes that they own, then that begins to get even more problematic. So the only real option that we have is in trying to do something about the under-responsiveness of supply and trying to do something about building more homes. Now, this is not itself an easy option. You know, I don't think anybody should really believe for a moment that it's a politically easy option to go around saying that we need to start developing large numbers of more homes. But the policy levers are fairly obvious. You know, actually, ultimately, if you want to build more homes, it's quite easy. You identify some money, you pay somebody to go out there and to build some more homes. Obviously, it gets a bit more complicated than that, and there are lots of reasons that we're not building enough homes at the moment. But I think the fundamental thing to hold on to is this. Really, when it comes down to it, building more homes is the only sort of substantial practical option that we have. London has done it before, London can do it again, and trying to point towards socioeconomic solutions, or indeed something like regulatory solutions which will help around the margins and the fringes, will not cut the mustard, because they're just either not going to happen or they're going to be insufficient to do something about it. So that's really my pitch for why we need to build more homes.
Our next speaker is Tom Copley, who's a Labour London Assembly member. Tom was elected to the London Assembly as a London-wide list member in May 2012 and is the Labour Group spokesperson for housing of the Assembly. He's currently chair of the Assembly's Housing Committee and is a member of the Planning and Transport Committees. He also sits on the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority. He's consistently raised issues around the lack of housing supply across all tenures, rents and conditions in the private rented sector and the increase in rough sleeping with Mayor. He's also a member of the London Labour Housing Group. Tom.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today. Yes, I suppose on the London Assembly, my main role is to keep an eye on Boris Johnson. And some people say, is it a full-time job? And I say, yes, it is. But of course, the other very important role that we have is to scrutinise and examine and research the issues that matter and are important to London and to Londoners. And the fact I do at least one of these meetings a week suggests that the housing in London is a rather important topic, and indeed it is. Although I have to say I rarely do these meetings in such auspicious and beautiful surroundings, so it's a pleasure to be here. And for me, housing is the most crucial thing. I mean, some people ask, why take up housing as your sort of main topic of interest? And the reason, I suppose, is that the home is at the centre of people's lives, and it's the place where you wake up in the morning, it's the place you come back to after work or school. And the condition and affordability of your home has such a knock-on impact on other aspects of your life, on health, both mental and physical, on children's education. It really does sit at the heart of so many things, and I think once you start to get housing right, so many other things begin to fall into place. But that's why, of course, it's so tragic that for the last at least 30 years in this country, we haven't got it right. And that, I'm afraid, is the fault of successive governments to get a grip on the real issue. And the real issue, as John has said, is building enough homes. And we quite simply haven't built enough homes in this country or this city for getting on, probably for more than 30 years. So in the last year in London, we built just 18,000 homes. 18,000 homes. The Mayor of London's own estimate of how many homes we need to be building each year in London is just under 50,000. 50,000 a year for the next 20 years, which is a level of house building we've never seen in London, certainly in the post-war period. But we did used to do a lot better than that. In 1978, councils alone built more homes than were built across all tenures last year. And I mention councils because they're incredibly important, because we have never built the homes that we need since local authorities, since the public sector has got out of the business of house building. And that happened post-1980 with the introduction of right to buy. And it wasn't the policy of right to buy, it wasn't the ability of people to buy their own council homes per se that was the issue, but the fact that councils were prevented from replacing these homes. So you went from a situation where councils were building at one point half of all the homes we were building in this country to them building almost no homes by the mid to late 1990s. And there started to be a small increase over the last few years, thanks to some changes that were made by John Healey when he was Housing Minister under Gordon Brown. But due to an artificial limit which is placed on how much councils can borrow for housing, they are unable to invest to their full potential. So one thing we need, but sadly one thing which I don't think will be forthcoming under the current government, is for that cap to be lifted, to enable councils to deliver the homes that we need. And in London alone, that would free up about £2.8 billion to deliver new housing. Not enough by any means to solve the problem, but certainly it will be a very welcome addition to what is happening at the moment. Because the private sector will never solve this problem. It doesn't have any incentive to. The private sector has essentially carried on over the last few years, building on average roughly the same number of homes per year as it built before Right to Buy were introduced. It never came in to fill the gap left by councils because it has an incentive to restrict supply to drive up house prices, which it of course has done so very successfully. Housing associations have played a valiant role in trying to fill the gap left by councils, but again they've come nowhere near. And so that's why public sector involvement in housing is so crucial. And as I say, some councils in London are now building the first new council homes in 4 decades, but they could do a lot more if they were given the ability to do so. There are sadly other changes which are now going to make it more difficult for housing associations even to deliver genuinely affordable housing. The government has now stretched the definition of affordable to beyond the breaking point with their new policy of starter homes, which in London will cost up to £450,000. Now bear in mind the average house price in London is now just over £500,000. So that is supposedly affordable housing costing not a lot less than the average house price. And that's certainly not going to benefit the people who have traditionally needed social rented housing or even the affordable rented housing which was introduced under the coalition. It is a misuse of the word affordable. It's not genuinely affordable. And the new housing bill, which is going through the House of Commons soon, will prevent councils from insisting upon genuinely affordable housing in development and force them to accept these starter homes instead. And that is not only bad in terms of the housing crisis, it is of course a massive interference from central government in local government when we've been told for years that what we need is localism and devolution. But on the subject of what we can do in London, and I'll have to finish up my remarks on this, I do think there is some hope if we have a mayor who is willing to take some more positive action. I've switched my efforts from trying to persuade the current mayor of this to his potential successor, because this mayor is of course on his way out and we will have a replacement next May. But given that the scale of house building that's required has never been achieved, and certainly has never been almost achieved even without the presence of the public sector, I think we need the mayor to start intervening by using his considerable borrowing power and ability to approach private investors in order to raise the funds to get City Hall delivering genuinely affordable homes directly. And this is something that the mayor has the power to do, and which I hope the mayor will do next year. Similarly, bringing back things like the 50% target for affordable housing, even though that definition is now being stretched, it would at least do some good in terms of solving the problem. And finally, the mayor needs to bid for powers from the government. He doesn't have these powers at the moment, but bid for powers from government to be able to effectively regulate the private sector, which John has already described the terrible conditions that exist for many tenants who are renting for private landlords. We need the mayor to have more powers to be able to deal with this directly. And in fact, we need more powers across the board for London to be able to solve this problem. It's not just a personal crisis now, it's also a crisis for business and London's international competitiveness. And unless we do start to get a grip on this, we're not just going to have a housing crisis, we're going to have a housing catastrophe. And on that very depressing note, I'm afraid I shall have to finish.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Alison Gelder, who is the Chief Executive of Housing Justice. She was appointed as the second Director of Housing Justice, which was formerly the Catholic Housing Aid Society, in August 2006. Alison has degrees in law and theology, and her paid employment has included spells in senior management at British Telecom and as a social researcher specialising in church-based social action and mission research. As a volunteer, she's chaired a law centre management committee and worked overnight shifts in a winter shelter. She is a Roman Catholic and describes herself as a serial pilgrim. Alison.
So I'm going to pick up on some of the things that have been raised so far, but I thought I'd start by saying something about Housing Justice's role. Our role is to help churches tackle homelessness and housing need in our communities. And so in London particularly, we are helping churches to work with homeless people, but we're also helping churches to work with badly housed people, with the whole range. And we try and be a Christian voice on housing and homelessness, and we help a church do anything from open its doors to be a night shelter like this church does, right through to, if you've got a redundant building, think about knocking it down and converting it into social housing. I first want to pick up on this definition of affordable, because I hate it when people take language and twist it to mean something that it doesn't actually mean. And this is definitely what's happened to the word affordable now. So affordable housing includes everything from these starter homes that Tom just mentioned, through to council houses. It includes houses that are rented at up to 80% of market rent. It includes shared ownership homes. It includes community land trust homes. And as such, it's become meaningless, because to me, affordable means something that you can pay for and still have enough money left over to live the rest of your life. And so one of the things that I'm really trying to push about at the moment is the idea that affordable should be related to people's income, not related to market prices or anything like that. And at the East London Community Land Trust, we've defined affordable for the houses that we're selling as land trust homes to be linked to the median income in town hamlets. And I'd like to see that model copied in other places. Then I've picked 4 campaigning points that I think could be used to attack the housing bill that's going through Parliament at the moment. It's got its second reading on Monday, so if you want to contact your MP over the weekend, it's a good time to do it. Again, 2 of the points that Tom picked up. Local authorities should be allowed to borrow more money against the value of the homes that they already own, so that they can build homes for genuine social rent. That's one of the ways that we can do it. And also, local authorities should not be forced to include starter homes as part of the affordable homes element when they're making agreements with developers of new private housing. A local authority knows what sort of affordable homes its community needs. The government has no idea whatsoever. So local authorities should have that freedom, should keep that freedom which they have at the moment. 2 other ones, though, are related to right to buy and the introduction of right to buy too. The first one is that there should be protections against right to buy too for homes that have been built with charitable funds. And the big housing associations like Peabody, most of their homes were built with charitable funds, they've won that exemption, but the little housing associations don't have that security yet, so we need to push for that. But I think that protection should also be extended to homes that were social homes that were built on church land or other donated land or community land trust homes, so that social housing can be affordable in perpetuity and not sold off and then the bonus given to the starter home buyer or whatever, and then it goes back into the open market and you have to start off trying to build new affordable homes again. And then the way that the government says it's going to pay for right to buy too, so that housing associations can replace the homes that they sell off, is by forcing local authorities to sell high-value homes. Now, I think that local authorities shouldn't be forced to sell high-value homes if they have a significant housing waiting list. So if they can say, look, we've got several thousand people here who need homes, why should we be selling these ones off when they're obviously needed for people on the waiting list? But it's not going to be as straightforward as that, because it looks like the government are going to set an amount of money that they think a local authority should be able to raise each year from the sale of high-value homes, and just send them a bill to send that money to the Treasury every year, regardless of whether any of those homes have actually become vacant and therefore available for sale or not. So it is just another way of clamping down on the powers of local authorities and limiting their freedom to serve their communities. So those are my campaigning points. Now, I thought you might want some practical things that you could do, and I'm a bit more optimistic than John about people actually being able to change things. So here are my 6 things that you can do. I don't know how many of you are Christians or people of faith, but the first thing you should be doing is praying about this, praying about the housing problem, praying about homelessness, praying for there to be more homes and for people making the decisions about house building to be influenced by that. The next thing links through to Amanda and the work of citizens collecting stories. Housing isn't a problem for everybody. If it is a problem for you, or if you know somebody who it's a problem for, you should be sharing that story to make sure people really know it's a problem. Next thing, you should be informed about what the situation is in your community. It's no good saying, oh dear, there's a crisis, but not knowing any of the facts and figures. So all of us have a responsibility to find out what the issue is in your area. Then we can do stuff to ease the pain. We can have night shelters. We can have other schemes to help people. We can mentor homeless people, all of those sorts of things. So we should be easing the pain. But we can also do stuff to practically help there be more housing and more affordable housing. So we can get involved in creating neighbourhood plans for our areas that say what sort of housing is needed and where that's housing needed. And there's lots of ways to do that. And we can increase the supply of affordable housing. I wouldn't suggest knocking down this beautiful building and making social housing instead, but some churches, that is the solution. But there's a continuum from that extreme to the other end, which is, do you have a spare room? Could you let it out to a lodger? Could you make it available temporarily to somebody who's homeless, perhaps somebody coming out of a night shelter, perhaps a destitute asylum seeker or a young person? So that, and if you're lucky enough to be a buy-to-let landlord, could you actually rent your property out at less than the market rent? So there are things that we can do. And then I think the last thing I want to say is that housing justice is here to help you if you want to do any of those things. We've got forums, we've got toolkits, we've got people who can help you. And we can all do something. This is a huge problem. But if all of us do something, we really can make a difference. So whether you start to pray or whether you let out your room or let your home at a lower than market rent, do something.
Just remind you to be thinking of things that you might want to ask our panel when we have our Q&A at the end. Our final speaker is Amanda Walters, who has been an organiser for Citizens UK, and I think you're going to explain what that is, I hope, for the last 2 years. Amanda leads the North Kensington Housing Inquiry for West London citizens, and this church is a member institution of West London citizens. Before that, Amanda spent time in Brazil helping communities organise for their own housing rights. Would you welcome Amanda?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. I'm going to focus in the next 10 minutes about what citizens such as yourselves can actually do about the housing problems that your communities are facing. So West London Citizens is a branch of a bigger charity called Citizens UK, and that is an alliance of different civil society institutions. such as religious organisations, educational institutions, charities and so on, that work together on issues of the common good. So for the past year, we have been working in North Kensington doing a housing inquiry, and I would like to outline today one of the things that we've been campaigning on and the route that we took to win on this issue as an example of things that you can do right here. When people think of Kensington and Chelsea, people tend to think of it as an affluent area, and it definitely is so, but it also has pockets of deprivation within it. And when I started organising there a year ago, our schools and charities and local churches wanted to work on the problem of housing. So we brought together representatives from each of those institutions in order to build a strong team and start this inquiry. The reason why we did an inquiry is because the problem of housing is enormous, and we needed to work out what is the slice of that problem that we are going to try and tackle. So we managed to get 15 institutions, local institutions, to be involved in that campaign, and each one did research within their institutions to find out what are the biggest housing issues that are affecting your members. They did that through door knocking, questionnaires, attending meetings in order to discuss these issues, and we listened to over 300 residents about housing. What we found was that the biggest issue, local issue, was that the repairs of the council estates were in a dire state. And to give you an example of that problem, I'll tell you Manira's story. Manira is a parent at Kensington Aldridge Academy, and she's been living at Lancaster West Estate next to the academy for about 10 years now. And a couple of years ago, in Manira's flat, her light started flickering in her kitchen, and she couldn't work out why. She rang the Tenant Management Organisation, otherwise known as the TMO, which does the repairs for the estate. And she rang them up, called the call centre, had someone that was quite rude on the phone, and eventually got someone out to, an electrician to come and look at it. The electrician came, had a look at the light, said, "Oh, it's because you're using an energy-saving light bulb," and told her that she needed to change that. So she went off, changed the light bulb, and obviously the same thing happened. Second electrician came, said there's nothing wrong with it, left. By the time the third electrician came, Manira was so angry, she said to him, "You're not leaving until this problem is fixed." And he cornered him in her house. And he went around looking at all the wires, all of the electrical boxes, absolutely everything in the house to figure out what is happening with this light. And what he worked out, he suddenly looked at one of the wires, gasped and said, "You don't have an earth wire." Manira had never heard of an earth wire in her life and said, "What is that?" And he said, "It's the cable that goes to the ground that makes sure that you don't get an electric shock and die." Obviously, Manira, having children in the house, was in absolute panic and said, "What are you going to do about this?" And he said, "Well, I have to speak to the TMO. I need to see if they want to fix this. It's up to them. I can't do anything until they give me the go-ahead. I will write to them urgently and tell them that this needs to be fixed, but you need to tell them as well." And just before he left Manira's house, he said, "Please be really careful." So you would think that the TMO, knowing that someone doesn't have an earth wire in their house, would fix that problem immediately. But it took Manira 3 months to get the TMO to come and fix that problem. Every time that she rang the call centre, she would get someone different, someone quite rude that wanted to get her off the phone, that would not be able to find her repair issue on the system. So time and again, she had to repeat over and over again, "This is my problem and this is what's been going on." And they would always say to her, "Okay, we've logged it in now and we'll get back to you." And obviously they never did. So a lot of residents in the estate had similar stories to Manira and felt really, really angry about this. So we decided that that was going to be the issue that we were going to try and tackle. And the first thing we needed to do was work out, why are the TMO so rubbish? What is it within their system that means that they're not able to sort these sorts of problems out quickly? And what we found was that in the call centre, the ladies at the call centre didn't have access to what the repairs management team and the contractors were doing on the repairs. So they were logging in the repair, it was going off to this other computer system where things were happening and people were being sent out to do the contract, but no one was logging it in just one place where they could see, okay, someone's come out, okay, this is the next step, this is what needs to happen next. There's just no central system where this could all be logged in. So we finally found, okay, this is the thing that we want to change. We need an online system that everyone can use, the residents can use it, the TMO, the contractors, just to make everyone's life a bit easier. So in order to win on this campaign, we decided to hold a 200-strong meeting, and we invited the Chief Executive of the TMO, Robert Black, in order to come and answer to these questions. And we were in this tiny room, training room, in one of our schools, which actually had capacity for 100 people, so there were people standing up all at the back. It was really packed and hot, you can imagine. And we sat Robert Black right in front of the lectern, in front of Manera, who got to tell her story face to face to Robert Black about what had been happening in her house. And then we invited Robert Black to come up, and we had our team on one side and he was on the other side. And we had sat the leader of the council and the cabinet member for housing for Kensington and Chelsea on the front row, who are the people that give Robert Black his budget every year. And after hearing Manera's story, obviously he looked quite uncomfortable, he came on stage and we asked him, Robert Black, will you work with us in order to create an online system so that repairs can be done quicker, so that residents don't have to keep chasing up people at the call centre, and we can save everyone time? And Robert Black took a look at the leader of the council, took a look at Manera, took a look at the 200 angry residents in front of him, and he had no choice but to say yes, as you can imagine. So that's just one example of what the local community can do to tackle some of the housing issues that you'll be experiencing in your communities. There are, however, things that are bigger than a repairs issue on an estate, and that, for those issues, we need to work together with other institutions, with bigger alliances in order to tackle them. So, in order to use the opportunity of the mayoral election in 2016, we're going through a similar process as we did in our housing inquiry, but in a much larger scale, so the whole of London. Our member institutions in London will be taking part in this campaign. So institutions such as this one are currently asking their members, what are the biggest housing issues that you're experiencing? To get to those stories, to get to the Manera type stories that make these campaigns alive and mean that people will act on them. And with that, we're going to work out, okay, so out of this massive problem with housing, what are the slices of this problem that we can take forward and build some asks around? Now, some of the things that have come up already, obviously affordability for rent and ownership, a lack of power and control for local people to influence developments and regenerations in their communities, and also bad experiences with private sector landlords as well. And we're finding that a lot of middle income people all over the city are having to move out, and this represents a strategic challenge for the health of the whole city and not just for families. Once we have our specific asks, we have invited Zach Goldsmith and Sadiq Khan to a huge gathering where we're going to bring 5,000 people together in the Copper Box in the Olympic Park, and we will have Zach Goldsmith and Sadiq Khan on stage answering to our housing asks. I wonder if they're going to say yes or no in front of 5,000 people in the press. I know this church is involved in the process, and I don't know whether, Simon, you'd be able to stand up. If you'd like to be involved in this campaign, then Simon's the person to speak to. And after this, we'd like to hear your stories about the housing problems that you're experiencing. But the message that I want to leave to you is that this isn't just for the housing experts or for politicians to solve. This is something that we can all act on and be active agents in solving the housing problems that we face in London. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers. Please do be thinking of a question that you'd like to ask or a comment that you'd like to make. And while you're thinking about that, we've got a roving mic, I think, which will go around. Perhaps I can ask the panel one thing that is very pertinent to this area. We're right here in central London. You might think that no one lives here. There are very few people who live here. I happen to be one of them. But one of the issues that happens in central London and in the centre of capital cities is buy-to-leave practices. So investors buy up properties and leave them empty. and this is a major issue for central London. How do you think we can make investment work for us instead of against us by creating ghost towns? Tom?
First of all, buy to leave is a problem in certain parts of London, including this one, although across the whole of Greater London it's not as big an issue as a lot of people think it is. So the last figures I saw, there are only 29,000 long-term empty homes in London, some of which will be subject to things like inheritance and things like that if someone's just died. But I do think it's unacceptable for any home to be left empty long term in the situation that we've got. So I would like to see, for example, punitive tax rates being applied to empty homes. But it wouldn't be a silver bullet. I mean, given we need to build 50,000 homes a year, we're not talking about being able to solve the problem alone with that. In terms of new build, though, Islington Council have some very good planning policy, which they put in place, which means that developers and owners have to prove that properties are occupied. The onus is on them to prove it, and there are penalties, I believe, if they don't. So I think other local authorities should be looking at what they can do. And in terms of channeling investment more productively, I think the mayor ought to be setting up some sort of fund and saying to investors, rather than buying up, a property, and most investors will rent the property out, won't leave it empty. But either way, why not? Rather than buying a property, driving up the price of property in London, why not invest in this fund? I'll pay you a return on the investment, but we'll use that money to deliver homes that are genuinely affordable for Londoners and people who actually want to live and work in London. I think that's the kind of solution that a future mayor should be looking at.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on this?
I think Tom's exactly right. It's really galling, isn't it, when you hear about sea properties? I think it's that it really the kind of the emotional impact of the sense of injustice of these people. Some people haven't got a home at all, and then you're seeing other homes that are being left empty. And I think sometimes it can be quite hard to square that the sense of unfairness with the reality that actually it can only be a part of the solution and a fairly minor part of the solution. There is another issue, however, which is less obvious, which is people investing in land which they then don't do anything with, and that again, that's not so much going to be a problem in central London, just because values are so high and because things move fairly quickly. But that's more of a problem as you get out into the fringes of London and further outside. And I think that's another one where you would say, if you're going to sit on this and not do anything with it and wait for values to escalate and not build the home because you think you can get something later down the line, then we're going to tax you for that. We're going to charge you a tax rate. So I think that's another thing that we should look at.
Thank you. So can we go to the audience? We've got a roving mic here. So right at the back, first of all, please.
I'm curious. I live in the borough of Wandsworth, and it seems a lot of the housing that's built is sold to overseas landlords and is sold on. It's upping the prices. There's never homes available for local people. Could there not be some legislation that says, even if you live overseas but you have a property in this country, you should rent it fairly, or you should pay a premium tax rate to keep the ownership of homes here?
So the issue of overseas landlords, does anyone would like to comment on that? Alison?
Well, I think I don't object to overseas landlords as long as they actually take care of the property. But on the estate that I live on, quite a lot of the properties have been, it's a council estate, people have bought council homes and then moved back to live in another country abroad, and they let the home rot. And so I'd like to see some kind of better enforcement of landlords who leave their properties in disrepair. And I know in national park areas there are restrictions put on who can buy homes, and the Channel Islands are the archetypal example of where, in order to buy a home there, you have to prove that you've got a local connection. That is kind of vaguely attractive for London, but on the other hand, one of the biggest problems that homeless people in London have is trying to prove that they've got a local connection somewhere in order to find a home there. So I'm quite loath to bring in those kind of local connection rules for other things as well.
Just to add, I mean, people talk about overseas buyers, but I don't see why we separate out overseas investors from domestic property speculators. It all has the same effect, which is to push up demand for housing. In France, they have a property speculation tax, which means that if you sell a home after a year, you pay a very high rate of tax on it, and that rate of tax is reduced over the years in order to discourage people from simply buying it up and selling it very quickly to make a profit. So that sort of thing could be looked at. But I mean, John's already talked about the land market. You've got to sort out the land market. A land valuation tax, I think, would be a very good way of dampening some of this down, because it would enable us to get some more control over the land market, and it would reduce land speculation, which is the crucial thing, because it would make it much less profitable just to buy up a piece of land and sit on it while it accumulates in value.
Oh, okay, yeah. No, it's all right, you go, and then I'll come to... Yeah.
Well, I think I'd certainly say I very much appreciate what Amanda was saying about social action. But I suppose what John and Tom have said makes me particularly very concerned, because to me we're looking at a catastrophic failure of governance, depending upon your point of view. If you're a property owner or you have capital, then of course the governance process is perfect because you're benefiting. But by and large, the people in the communities who are not benefiting will feel the exact opposite. And it seems the failure of devolution of power to the right local level to solve the problem is the fundamental problem, because centrally we have a much too heavily centralised governance system, and indeed maybe even our electoral system is not helping that either.
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman, we'll take a couple and then I'll direct them to the panel. So the gentleman in front.
Yes, thanks very much. We've always had a policy of having our home open for other people to live in, for nothing. We can't do that at the moment, Alison, because it's full of my children after university and their friends, who cannot afford to live in the place where they've grown and have an affiliation with. And I suppose it's kind of linked to my observation and perhaps question, and that is, my folks are always, my mum and my dad, God rest them, have always been council tenants until the day they died. And they had a great deal of pressure put on them, not necessarily by the then council, but by just society in large, to buy that for me to inherit money. And I'm really pleased they didn't do that as a matter of principle. And we haven't heard tonight from any of the panellists the idiom of a right to rent. And I'm just wondering, because I think that's a really important phenomenon which is lost in our country, which seems to be something on the continent is not lost. I'm just wondering how the panellists might help campaign for us to change our cultural aspect to embrace an idea of a right to rent.
Thank you very much. We'll take one more over this side. Yes, Buck.
I have specific questions about the right to buy, both for housing associations and for council houses, but I want to put it in the wider context. And the wider context is that what we've seen for the last 20 years is the privatizing of collective resources, whether that is schools or the National Health Service or housing. and it makes me very angry. I live in Southwark. It is the largest council house owning borough in the area. Here come my questions about the sale of social housing. First of all, affordable rents are now at 80% of market value. I think that's fucking scandalous. There is no proposal for resetting levels of council rents. And I want to know, I understand that the estate on which I lived, the loans for building that estate in the 60s are still being paid off. But the flats are being sold at about 2/3 of their value, and then very quickly shoot up in price when they're on the free market. And the benefit is not ring-fenced. It goes straight back into the treasury. There are some faint noises about one-for-one replacement of sold council houses, or maybe possibly housing association. I don't think it's happening. It's certainly not happening where I live. And it makes me very angry. I think it is a robbery of societal resources that we have built up over the last 60 years. It's unchristian, it's improper, and it's immoral. And I want to see how we can take that up as a topic. We are selling out collective resources and privatizing the profits. That goes for housing as much as for anything else.
Okay, thank you. We have a catastrophic failure of government, particularly devolution has failed. We have the right to rent, and perhaps you can comment on that, and the privatisation of collective resources. How can we make those public resources again? So perhaps, can we start with the right to rent, because that's a very evocative phrase. Who'd like to speak about that?
I can take. I'll say something about. I don't know if I'm. Well, I'll say something about the right to rent, but I think it's something you get asked a lot. Why the obsession with ownership? Why do we have this obsession with ownership? It's worthwhile saying that we're not alone in Europe with having an obsession with ownership. In fact, we now have a lower rate of home ownership than the average for Europe. So I think lots of the time people say, on the continent, that they don't have this obsession with ownership, and Germany is a bit of an outlier, as it happens. They don't have an obsession with ownership, although they increasingly do. But they're a bit of an outlier. Now, I mean, that's no excuse. Why do we have an obsession with ownership? I mean, because who would rent? I rent. It's expensive and it's crummy. So broadly, the idea that you would want to live in that for the rest of your life, in a situation where you are broadly, the law is not on your side, you're not in a strong bargaining position to get your landlord to improve things with your property. You're certainly not in a strong bargaining position to control your rents. I think in that situation, it seems to me that there are very good reasons to think that ownership sounds like a good idea. Certainly, I think we need to be doing a lot to improve regulation of the private rented sector and the deal that renters get. But whilst we have a private rented sector which is in the condition that it's in, I think it should not be a surprise to anybody that people would prefer to own where they have control over their housing conditions. So that's me on right to rent.
Ask Amanda and Alison to comment on the right to rent, perhaps. Amanda.
Yeah, so with a lot of the residents in Kensington and Chelsea that we questioned, one of the reasons why a lot of them wanted to be able to buy, even though they could never dream of it, was because of the links to the community. So they've been in this community for their entire lives and want to leave something behind for their children who have grown up in this community, who go to school in the community, who work in the community. But the thought that, one day their landlord may decide that they're going to be turfed out means that they're going to have to go really far now. A lot of these people that are living on these council estates are not going to be able to rent anywhere near where they've grown up and where they live and where they have, the links to the community. So I think, even though, people should have a right to rent, I think being able to own your own property, and being able to have that stability is really important to people as well.
Alison?
I think the thing that most private renters don't have, which is the thing that council tenants and housing association tenants have, is security. So you have to really mess up to be evicted. And also you've got the ability to decorate and make the place look your own. And if you're in the private rented sector, you just can't do that. So, and those are two of the things that really matter to people, and those are the sorts of changes that we need to bring in to the rental market if we want to make it more aspirational. But the other thing I think that's needed alongside that is some kind of alternative asset class, because the reason why a lot of us buy homes is some kind of insurance against old age, as something to pass on to our descendants. It's money for a rainy day. If anything went really wrong, I could sell my house and maybe I could live for a few years. So without that kind of alternative asset that people who rent could be investing in, I think people are always going to want to buy homes.
And perhaps, Tom, can you comment on the catastrophic failure of government?
Absolutely. Can I also say, first of all, just quickly on the renting stuff, in Germany, I mean, I completely agree with John. I mean, 60% of the rent, they have unlimited tenancies, they can decorate their homes. Usually they come completely unfurnished, not even with kitchens, you bring in literally everything. And it's a long-term tenure where you have rights. They also have decent pensions, so they don't worry about renting into old age. On the catastrophic failure of government and the devolution, that was the thing. I'm very much into devolution, but it has to be real devolution that involves not just devolving, essentially delegating government responsibility and saying you have to do it this way. We're going to give this to you, but you can only act in the way that we say. Devolving cuts, basically. You actually need to devolve real power and real ability to raise finance. And what I would like to see for London, I mean, in London we're better off in terms of devolution than the rest of English regions and English cities. But I would like to see London with similar powers to Mark I Scottish devolution. So similar to the original devolution settlement for Scotland. I think that given we have a bigger population in Scotland, given we are economically bigger, you have to be careful to make sure that you don't end up with a situation where London simply keeps all of its resources here and doesn't transfer any to the rest of England in redistribution. I'm very much into redistribution. But other systems around the world, like the German federal system, show that you can do that. They have a federal system, which I would like to see in Britain. And they have big transfers of wealth from the richer states to the poorer states. So I think it can be done. I don't see why London has to crawl to the Treasury every time we want a new big infrastructure project. We should be able to do these things ourselves. We should be able to solve the problems that we have. We are far too centralised. Let's give power away from the centre.
And before we go to the audience again, there was a comment about the privatisation of collective resources and how can people campaign against that, or what can we do to reverse that situation, if indeed you think it needs reversing. Anyone would like to comment? Alison.
I think there's two things here. One is housing is widely regarded as a private thing rather than a public thing. So house building isn't seen in the same light as other sorts of infrastructure projects. So one of the things we need to do is shift the balance of thought so that people see housing as a public thing and believe that as a community we have a responsibility for providing enough housing for the people in the community who need it. We're a long way from that at the moment, and we need to move back in that direction. And the only means that I think we have at our disposal is social pressure. And it's only by speaking out from pulpits, speaking out with our friends, tweeting and using radio phone-ins, by expressing disapproval of people who hoard housing, disapproval of people who profiteer through housing, disapproval of people who leave their homes empty. It's only by voicing those things that we can hope to apply enough social pressure to make a difference.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with something Alison said earlier on, actually, in her opening pitch, which is about the housing and planning bill at the moment, and speaking to your MPs and representatives about the housing and planning bill, because I do think there has been a sort of a raid, if you like, upon the nation's housing, like the public housing wealth over the last few decades. But there's a current, there are plans afoot to continue that raid and make it even worse. And if you look at the way the government is currently planning to pay for its right to buy by forcing councils to sell off high-value homes, that really just means sell off homes in expensive areas. So Kensington and Chelsea, goodbye to your council homes. They are going, and where is the money going from that? Well, I can tell you it's not going into new homes in London, because the only way they're going to, the current plans around right to buy are going to stack up is if a considerable amount of London's housing resource is taken from London and goes to fund right to buy discounts across the rest of the country. Now, I speak as a man from the northwest. My heart lies somewhere on the edge of the Peak District, in part. But I know that the housing crisis in London is the most acute housing shortage in this country, and if there is housing resource that's needed anywhere, it's needed here. So that's one aspect of that continuing raid upon London's housing wealth. The other one, if I can very briefly mention starter homes. Starter homes are spoken about as something which are unaffordable, and they're not good because they're not affordable to people. But for me, the biggest scandal of starter homes is this is a discount that you get, a 20% discount that you get off the value of your home, which you only have to wait for 5 years before you can cash in. So you buy a home, let's say, you're lucky enough to try and get together the money to buy a home for £450,000. Let's imagine you're at the top. You wait 5 years and you're able to go and not only get the benefit of any potential uplift in value that home's got, but the 20% discount, which is locked in from day one, you're able to cash in. It seems like an utter scandal that we are putting public resources into giving money to people who can afford to buy homes that are worth £450,000, so that they can then just go, I won the monopoly. It's just, the mind boggles. So yes, I completely and utterly agree.
Thank you. Just have a point from Amanda on that campaigning for collective resources, and then we'll come to some more questions. There were some over here, I think.
So I think a lot of this comes down to the question, who is London for? Because is it for the private interests of these developers and other people who are buying up these properties, or is it for the communities that are living there? And I agree with Alison that we need a culture shift about how we talk about housing and what we think about housing. So 10 years ago, when Citizens UK started the living wage campaign, everyone said that no one would pay it. Voluntarily, companies would not pay the living wage, and now we have 2,000 companies paying it. I think we need a very clear campaign that we're all working towards, and to put pressure on people at the local level, at the city level, at government level, in order to tackle some of these big issues.
Yeah, just make a small point to do with renting. It's not just a right to rent. There's a simple fact that a certain proportion of the population will never be able to buy, not just because they're out of the economic sector, they're out of the economic scope for it. There are just simply some people who will never be able to buy, who will have low income and who will always need to rent, and they should not be subjected to the public, to the private sector in order to rent, because it doesn't work for them. And there are people who, for other reasons, can't do anything other than rent, because of mental health, because of other issues. And so there is a responsibility for society to ensure that there's enough affordable property for them to rent that's secure, So it's not about social change or anything like that. It's government policies. And just one final point, it was government's policy changes that caused all of this in the first place. It wasn't social change, it was government policies, and they can change again. It just needs to be changed, the government change the policies. So.
Thank you. The gentleman behind you.
I'll again try and be as brief as possible. I think it's appropriate, I mean, since we're in a church, that we remember, we have a Christian view to this, and remember what John Ruskin said in the 19th century. It was the first duty of the state to see that all newborn babes born there within are well housed. I think we should just remember that today, actually, when we think of housing more as commodities, more and less as somewhere to shelter.
Yes. Yes, you.
Affordable housing, a great concept, brilliant. But by making housing more affordable, you reduce the value of houses. If you reduce the value of houses, you irritate the owner-occupiers who own the houses. That's maybe, it's certainly more than half the population. It's not me, but it's more than half the population. That creates a political issue, and I think politics has got us into this mess in the first place. So my question is, how do you manage the political fallout by irritating quite an incensed and important part of the electorate?
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That is a challenging and awkward thing, and I wanted to build on it by talking about this shift of thinking that's required, and ask the panel to comment on two campaigns. One is, and I think Tom hinted at it, this issue of a land value tax, because if that was looked into carefully, it seems to me that would stop the appreciation in value on private housing quite quickly. And secondly, the other campaign, it seems to me, that's important is is almost a campaign to ban the use of the word affordable. And instead, and I wonder if it might be linked to some of the work Amanda's organisation is doing over the last 10 years, if we've got a London living wage now, can we have a London living rent, which may be based on a formula of 20 to 25% of the London living wage? I took Alison's point that in fact in Tower Hamlets they've done a median thing, but if you're going to look at London, it may be too diverse to do it London-wide, but a London living wage, and just not to leave John out in my reference to the panel members, he's absolutely right about the way things get, the public sector's been raided, and although it will be an awkward political challenge, we should start, it seems to be, moving in and promoting a London living wage, and the importance, because land is commons, it's common land, and it ought to be publicly owned, as was said earlier on. Thank you.
I'm probably going to reveal a lack of vision here, but I wanted to explore realpolitik. We have a government which I think came in promising it was going to give right to buy to a wider collection. The whole direction of government policy, as people have observed, is not helping the crisis that we're talking about. What realistically can we expect to achieve before 2020 in national policy? To what extent are the Tory backbenchers, which I guess is the main audience we should be aiming for, amenable to some of the arguments that we've been putting forward today? That's one area. The other area of questioning is how much flexibility is there within the mayor's remit to do stuff despite the government?
Okay, we're going to go into the panel now, so perhaps we can put together two of those comments, one of which was about affordability reducing the value of homes and irritating more than 50% of the electorate who own their own homes. Link that with the realpolitik point that's just been made. What is realistically possible before 2020? I don't know who would like to comment on that. What's realistic? You're a politician, what's realistic?
I'll sort of go like this because the point was made about, again, about renting. Actually, if you want to increase home ownership, you have to build more social houses. It might sound slightly perverse, but actually, you simply build more homes to buy, they'll be bought up by investor landlords. You build more homes to social rent, you move people out of the private rented sector, you reduce demand in the private rented sector, you reduce demand from landlords and property speculators, and you start to get up control of house prices. To address the problem about the political issue, I think this would happen given we have to make up for 30 years of not building enough homes and build the homes that we need to cope with a growing population. It's going to be any downward pressure on house prices from increasing supply is going to happen rather slowly, and I think we'll probably see more of a levelling off and then catching up with inflation rather than a big crash. What's more likely to cause a crash is a loss of confidence, which could result from an increase in interest rates, for example, by the Bank of England. I think that's a much bigger threat politically than building more homes. And then just to finish off with this whole issue of what's possible, I have very little faith that anything that comes out of the government over the next 4 years, and they will be until 2020, there's no doubt about that because of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, I have very little confidence that any of it will be positive. There is some hope, perhaps the housing planning bill could be amended. There are Tory MPs that are unhappy about the extension of right to buy, although because it's now a voluntary arrangement with the associations, David Cameron is going around saying the housing associations agree with him, which they're unhappy about, but then they did sign up to a voluntary deal, so what did they expect? There is some hope that the House of Lords, who are now flexing their muscles, will make some amendments to make the bill less bad, but even if they do that, we're still going to end up with a bad piece of legislation. The hope is that the mayor, a newly elected mayor next year, might do something. There is scope within the mayor's existing powers, as I set out before, to raise the finance necessary for the mayor to intervene directly, whether that's setting up an investment to the wealth fund to build houses, or indeed using the mayor's borrowing powers to build houses. I think that the mayor can deliver a step change in the delivery of public housing, and that's the best hope for the next 4 years.
Could I ask you about two specific issues then? Perhaps we can ask John and Amanda and Alison to comment on these. The land value tax, is that something worth campaigning for? And what do you think of a London living rent as a concept?
Okay. Land value tax, or otherwise known as how do you make a politically difficult issue even more politically difficult? I think, undoubtedly, land value tax, I think, is the right answer. It's just not. It's not an easy answer because all of a sudden, England does not have a history of land taxation. We pay council tax, but that's typically a tax that looks more like a kind of tax upon for services. So it's an occupation tax more than an ownership tax, and we also pay stamp duty, but that's like a transaction tax. That's not a tax on your everyday ownership of a piece of land. The most powerful people in the country are those who own the most land broadly over an extended period of time. So introducing a new tax on them is very, very difficult, which is not to say I don't think it's the right answer, but I think it goes back to the heart of that, the question about the realpolitik. London living rent, I think, is great. And I think this brings back, I was going to say, I am a bit optimistic about what can be achieved, because it doesn't take a genius to turn something like starter homes into something that's quite good. If you begin to say, okay, well, £450,000 is too much, and we need to do something about who's eligible for it, so there needs to be a tighter restriction on who can apply for one, and you say, well, instead of you getting a discount, after 5 years you're able to sell it at its full value, you say, well, you're never able to sell it at its full value. You have to sell it on that 20% discount is locked in forever. Then it begins to look like a much more sort of affordable product and something that we would think of as reflecting existing affordable products. And I think you can achieve that by by just amending what's there already. So, in terms of the government's committed to do this, well, I think you can amend their existing plans. And I think the real reason for optimism is because, since they've come to power, it seems to me, when they have announced things like starter homes, they've gone down like a cup of hot sick you know, people haven't liked them broadly. And people broadly, when they hear more about them, like them even less. So it seems to me that amendment is going to be necessary at some point, and the government will hopefully see sense. So London Living Rent, I think, is an example of actually something that the government could be under pressure over the next 5 years to implement, and might think, oh, we need a new solution. We need something to offer beyond our existing offer, which is starter homes and the extension right to buy. So I think that there is a reason for optimism.
That's good, because you were depressed at the beginning.
Well, no, I think I come across as sounding depressed. I'm naturally cynical. I'm sorry about that.
Sorry, we've just run over time. I've allowed it to go over time because it's so interesting. But can we just have a final comment, perhaps from Amanda and Alison, and then we'll go for our refreshments.
So I think the idea of a London Living Rent is amazing. It would be great to see that campaign flourish and happen. So after we've collected all of the listening of everyone's stories of what the housing problems are, then when we decide, okay, this is the issue that we're going to focus on, which I'm assuming one of them will be affordability, seeing as that's the biggest issue in London at the moment. Then it's about, well, what are the solutions? And it is up to everyone in this room, along with other people in London, to come up with that solution together. So again, if you're interested in being part of this campaign and coming to those meetings where we're going to be discussing what are the solutions, how we're going to go about resolving this crisis, then please speak to Simon at the end to see how you can get involved as part of this church. But I'm very optimistic about what we can achieve. I think even though we have a Conservative government and it could be more difficult to get things changed, it's down to us whether or not we can achieve change, and that is by being proactive rather than being reactive. So it's about choosing those campaigns that we're going to champion and that we're going to be driving for, and making sure that we're clever about how we're taking action in the current context. And I think the mayor has the power to be a champion for those campaigns, even though he may not be able to change legislation. Having him as an ally is very helpful for everything that we're trying to achieve. And also, he does have control over certain developments as well. And so, we can be creative about what we ask for those developments, and making sure that we have affordable homes or the London Living Rent or whatever people want to have on those sites as well.
Thank you. Last word, Alison.
Okay. Absolutely. Living rent. It's a bit complicated when you try to work it out, and London's incomes are so diverse that it makes it more difficult, so it probably needs to be done on a borough-by-borough basis. But across the rest of the world, pretty much, everybody seems to agree that somewhere around 30% of your take-home pay is what's affordable, and I don't see why we shouldn't have a similar sort of standard. In terms of what's achievable, what can we hope to do between now and 2020? Well, the bits of the housing and planning bill that we haven't talked about are mainly the ones that are about the government introducing a much more laissez-faire approach to planning and development. And I think we need to look at those very carefully and get involved in planning decisions and the creation of plans in our local area, so that we're the people who influence the planning decisions, we're the people who influence what sort of houses are built and what sort of uses land is put to. And I think there's a lot of scope for us to do that. But I think the main thing is not what's going to happen politically. It is about how much can we change the weather between now and 2020. And that's what I think we really need to work on.
Could I, on your behalf, thank John and Tom and Alison and Amanda. It's been a very high quality discussion. Thank you very much indeed.